Hello and welcome to the Inspire Wellbeing Book Club. My name's Tony Macaulay and I'm an author, and I'd like to welcome to the book club today Nicola Rooney, who's a clinical psychologist, Lindsay Robinson, who is a mental health campaigner, and also Alex Bunting, who is the Director of Mental Health and Addiction Services at Inspire. And we're going to be talking about some of the books that have inspired us, challenged us, influenced us, particularly in relation to mental health and well-being over the years. So we're going to start with Nicola. And Nicola, could you tell us a little bit about your journey with books?
Yes, I've always been a reader. Books were a big part of my kind of family life. My father really pushed reading and education generally. So I've always enjoyed reading and found solace in books, escapism, more than kind of educational. That's why I enjoy being part of a book club. I enjoy reading books kind of out of my comfort zone. But there's no doubt that it was through books, and really, when I read books, it's about the relationships in books and the experiences that I find most interesting, So I suppose I'm still a psychologist when I'm reading them, but way before I was a psychologist, one of the things that kind of really grabbed me was a poem by Seamus Heaney, which I thought was relevant to today, and it kind of set me on a journey in my career that I've always stayed with. And it was his poem Midterm Break, and it's the story of him as a 14-year-old discovering that his young brother had been knocked down and killed, and it was his experience of what that was like. And it really touched me at the time for lots of reasons. One, around the time whenever I became aware of it, I suppose within Northern Ireland we were experiencing that, children in school finding out that usually their parents, maybe through the Troubles, had died. That was my greatest fear, that something would happen to my parents or any loved one. I was so scared of death. And then as I got older, and it always stuck with me that you don't usually hear the child's version of it. Adults usually the ones that deal with it, and children can often be left out. And that's something that I've kind of worked with a lot in my career. I've had a particular interest in kind of traumatic bereavement, and particularly for parents whose children have died, and also for children who have lost parents or siblings or experienced traumatic bereavement. So I really think it probably emanated from this poem. And actually, when I worked in the Royal, it was then Belfast Trust, and in the Children's Hospital, I was responsible for a bereavement service we ran every year for a number of years. And I used just to write to people and say, this is for parents whose children have died, for their brothers and sisters and grandparents, and you wouldn't give us some of your free time. And lots of people, Phil Calder, Kieran Goss, Eamon Holm, so many people, Juliet Turner after the Oma bomb, I remember, gave their time, no publicity, no money, but just gave their time to share that space and pain with the families. And I wrote to Seamus Heaney, and he drove up from Dublin and read this poem at the bereavement service, and I still get chills thinking about it, and just hearing him actually do it. And that was, for a poem that had actually influenced my career, my interest in kind of dealing with death and dying over the years, was special to me, and Seamus Heaney's a special person. So. And
here we are today in this wonderful home place, the Seamus Heaney Centre in Balakia, and we're in the library here today.
Yeah.
So, Nicola, would you read it to us?
Yeah, very happy to. Midterm break. I sat all morning in the college sick bay, counting bells, knelling, classes to a close. At 2 o'clock, our neighbours drove me home. In the porch, I met my father crying. He had always taken funerals in his stride, and Big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. The baby cooed and laughed and rocked the pram when I came in, and I was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand and tell me they were sorry for my trouble. Whispers informed strangers I was the eldest, away at school, as my mother held my hand in hers and coughed out angry, tearless sighs. At 10 o'clock, the ambulance arrived with the corpse stanched and bandaged by the nurses. Next morning, I went up into the room. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks. Paler now, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. He lay in the 4-foot box, as in his cot. No gaudy scars, the bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year.
Thank you, Nicola. It's interesting listening to that. One thing that I notice about it is Big Jim Evans is my wife's uncle.
Wow.
so
getting spookier.
Yeah. So my wife is from Malachi,
Right.
and today I wanted to talk a little bit about my own experience of suicide bereavement, and it's actually in my book Little House on the Peace Line. I wrote about this, which is about when I was living and working on the Peace Line in North Belfast in the 1980s, and I was going to talk a little bit about this today, because of the subject matter, but actually, my father's death is one chapter in this book. It's not a book about suicide, but it's one chapter of this book. But another chapter is about my wedding day, and I was married just across the road from here in Malachi in 1986. So what was interesting for me as a writer, when I decided I was going to write about this period of my life, of course this was a very important thing that happened to me. When I was 23 years old at the time, and my experience of writing it was actually quite different from other things that I've written. So I've written a lot of memoir in terms of my childhood, young adult life as well. But when I wrote this chapter about my father's death, it almost came out fully formed.
Right.
And I wondered at the time, normally I would write a chapter, it needs a lot of editing, needs a lot of work. And sometimes I have to check things for is the memory correct? I have to do a bit of research. And part of that for me, I think, was probably because I'd gone over that day in my mind so many times, and also because it was such a big thing that had happened in my life. But the other thing was, it was important to me that I would write that in a very honest way when I was writing Little House on the Peace Line, because for me it was important. Of course, sort of my way of breaking the stigma of talking about suicide, and also I think I was very clear. I was very clear about what I wanted to say about my experience of suicide bereavement, and to share how it's different from my other experiences of bereavement in my life. And actually, while I was writing this book, my mother died as well, as an elderly woman in her 80s, and I compared the difference of the experience of that bereavement from the bereavement of my father. So that's my experience of writing about suicide, bereavement, and mental health issues in relation to both my parents, both of whom were experiencing depression at that time. But the book that I'd like to share today in terms of our Wellbeing Book Club is this one by Tara West. It's called The Upside of Down, and I just love this book. Tara West is a Northern Irish novelist. I've got to know her a little bit over the years by us being on panels at big festivals and things like that. And she's a very bright, humorous, engaging person, very talented writer as well, and a really razor-sharp wit in her writing. And so I was really fascinated when she decided to write a memoir of her own story. It's a memoir of depression and recovery. And the title actually says it all, The Upside of Down. So I don't know, perhaps I was expecting, what people call a misery memoir, that it might be a hard read. And what I discovered as I read it was that she's very authentic, she's very honest, and it's quite raw at times, but it's also really inspiring. And I found myself laughing out loud at times when I was reading this book, and that's not what I expected you know, in reading a memoir about depression. So I'm gonna read a little bit from the prologue to the book, which really sets the book up. Dave, I say, we're sitting in our small living room, watching TV, drinking up the last of the weekend. Dave is wearing his favourite red and black striped jumper, and he's sprawled across the settee. I'm on the floor, chest pounding. Dave, what? I don't feel right. What? I cover my face with my hands and stop breathing. I know I'm acting weird. I know I look weird. He's beside me now. What's wrong? What is it? I don't feel right. What do you mean? How can I tell him? There's no way to say it, but it's too late. I've started and I can't go back. What is it? What's wrong? I am lost. I am lost. I am lost. Move your hands. What is it? You're scaring me. I don't want to tell him. I don't want to say the words that will break everything apart. But I'm lost, and I need someone to lead me out of the dark. I move my hands away from my face. I want to kill myself. I had a loving husband, a kind mother, a decent family, good friends, and a successful career in advertising. My first novel had just been published. What was there to be unhappy about? But I was beyond unhappy. I was sick, but it was my brain that was ill, or rather the bit inside my brain that was me. I had overdosed on brainwaves. I had mood flu. I'd hurt my thinker. I'd been diagnosing and treating my own illnesses since I was 17, but this time, no painkiller was going to do the job. I couldn't clean it up, smother it with Savlon and apply a plaster. I didn't know what to do. I'd never been sick like this before, and I didn't know anyone who had. So that gives you an insight into how Tara West writes. And I love her use of language. You know, she talks about, I had mood flu. She describes her depression as mood flu. And then she talks about, I've hurt my thinker. And I just think that sort of original language is a really interesting way of talking about her experience, and that's what you can expect in this book. Tara West, The Upside of Down. Lindsay, what book have you chosen today in terms of an inspiring story?
I've chosen a book by an author called Barbara Brown-Taylor, and it's called Learning to Walk in the Dark. And she is an American Episcopal priest and a theologian and a teacher and professor, and obviously a best-selling writer. And I picked this book particularly because as I recovered from my own period of mental illness and suicidal thoughts, one of the parts of life I found most difficult to put back together was the impact that had on my faith, and the questions I had about what did it mean as a person of faith to have struggled with mental illness and to have struggled with thoughts of suicide. And Barbara writes really well in helping us to see that actually seasons of difficulty or darkness, as hard as they are, don't always have to be the end. In fact, actually, sometimes we learn things in those seasons that we would never have learned if we hadn't gone through them. And it helped me to begin to reframe some of what I went through for 2 years. Not to say that it was good or that I was okay with it, but actually that there was something that I had learned out of it, or that there were little jewels or nuggets of gold. And certainly the more I began to think about that, the more I began to realise that actually, yes, that season had absolutely changed me, but in some ways it had changed me for good, because I see myself differently, I see the world differently, see people and pain differently, and I see my faith differently, and actually that's nothing to be afraid of. In fact, there's actually been a gift out of some of that as well. And one of the phrases that she uses often is the idea that new life starts in the dark. And if we think about a seed in the ground, it's in darkness, but actually from that season of darkness or being planted in the ground, something new comes. And I suppose to help all of us to not be as afraid of those seasons, and also not ashamed either, because I think sometimes we all struggle if we've been through something difficult, whether it is mental illness or a season of loss. We might be a bit ashamed to even talk about it or share about it, but actually to not see it in that way and to reframe it differently. And certainly it's been a real source of help and healing for me.
Great. And would you like to read a little section to us,
Yes,
Lindsay?
of course I could. Like darkness itself, the dark night of the soul means different things to different people. Some use the phrase to describe the time following a great loss, while others remember it as the time leading up to a difficult decision. Whatever the circumstances, what the stories have in common is a description of a time when the soul was tested, often to the point of losing faith, by circumstances beyond all control. No one chooses the dark night descends. When the dark night first falls, it is natural to spend some time wondering if it is a test or a punishment for something you have done. This is often a sly way of staying in control of the situation, since the possibility that you have caused it comes with the hope that you can also put it to an end, either by passing the test or enduring the punishment. The darker possibility that this night is beyond your control is often too frightening to consider at first, at least partly because it means that none of your usual strategies for lighting up is going to work. One of the hardest things to decide during a dark night is whether to surrender or resist. The choice often comes down to what you believe about God and how God acts, which means that every dark night of the soul involves wrestling with belief. And I simply picked that because for me, I struggled for so long to wonder whether I had done something to deserve the season I had been through or whether it was my fault. But actually, over these last number of years, coming to reframe it again and understand it really differently has been such a sense of freedom for me.
Thank you. That's really profound writing, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you, Lindsay. And Alex, you've also chosen a memoir as well. So tell us about the book that you have chosen.
I chose the book. I suppose I was looking for a book by a local writer, and I chose the book Afraid of the Dark. It's a memoir of mental health and fatherhood by Johnny McCambridge, and real powerful story about a young man who struggled with anxiety and depression most of his adult life, and coming to terms with having to deal with that. Also competing with journalism in a very busy job. His coping strategies, poor as they were in terms of alcohol use, smoking cigarettes till they were gone out of fashion, and really dysfunctional in terms of his approach to work, just to cover up the anxiety and depression that he had, and how in many ways the work was fueling that, and pushed him to a point where he had a breakdown. And then the second part of the book I think is very enlightening in terms of him becoming a father and trying to consider his mental health and how he was going to approach the rest of his life with a child. And typically Northern Irish style, some humour in there thrown in around his journey and his journey of discovery. He ended up in a mental health ward, but I think the most powerful thing for me in this book was his realisation around recovery. And it wasn't about recovering to be the person he wanted to be or the person he thought, but it was learning to live for the person that he was. And that was the biggest part in his book for me, in trying to understand his journey with mental health.
Great. And would you like to read a little section as well?
Yeah, I chose the very last part of Johnny's book, and it was a letter to himself,
Okay.
It's from his older self to his younger self, so I thought it was very powerful. You will also learn there is no universal path or method which leads you away from despair and towards contentment. There are many different ways of finding refuge, and the battle of each person has to find out what works best for them as individuals. When it comes to dealing with mental illness, the closest thing to an absolute truth that you will discover is the undeniable power and benefit of talking about it, and how much lighter the burden will feel when you share it with another. In your own way, by choosing to write and talk about your story publicly, you will perhaps play a tiny part in helping to dispel the stigma which hinders recovery for so many. I hope you will agree that that's a pretty good reason to stay alive. The problem with writing letters is knowing how to finish, how to find a neat way of summing up all of the things that have gone before. But how about this? You will have a family you will love. They will also love you, but more importantly, because of them, you will learn to love yourself.
Thank you. So it's really interesting, to hear those various examples that we have of those books that have inspired us or informed us or challenged us around mental health. So what difference do you think reading can make to your mental health? What's your view on that, Nicola?
Well, I mean, I suppose there's different reasons for reading. I mean, I would read textbooks and journal articles and actually learn about the science behind things and look for evidence bases. But in my personal reading for myself, I suppose it is, I do like stories where people have faced adversity, that, and it's usually for me around the people in it and the attachments and connectedness, and I think to be able to lose yourself, it's kind of solitary, but you're with other people. It's just a different way of kind of learning and feeling and kind of interacting with people. As a psychologist, you spend a lot of time talking to people and listening, so it's actually quite nice to see it written. And I can find myself much more emotional in books and texts, whereas in a therapeutic setting, you have to contain your emotions or the emotions that you're carrying for another person. It can be very cathartic, I think, really sensing it. So I love reading, and I think it's a great way to say there's so many benefits from it. I'm also in a book club, which is about connections, and again, which is so good for our mental health. So yeah, I thoroughly recommend lifting a book. Sometimes we're busy, and I suppose you do get in the sense you think, oh, books are, they're just work. They can be work. So this, I think the secret is to find something that has all those meanings but doesn't feel like work. It feels like, there's nothing nicer than sitting on a beach with a good book.
Yeah, that escapism is really good as well. I love reading books that are about places that I've never been to. Or, it could be a country I've never been to, a culture I don't really know, or it could be a planet in another universe, or it's science fiction or something. I love that escapism part. And what I found really interesting about book clubs, so as an author, I get invited sometimes to come to a book club. They've been reading my book, and I sort of pray that they liked it, and I just love going to book clubs. There's just something and just about the relationship when you come in there that they have with each other, because they've gotten to know each other quite well, because they're, the members of the book club, they're expressing their opinions about a book, so they get to know each other quite well. They have good debates about things. They don't always agree. They don't always like the same books. So there's kind of a maturity about the relationship they have, because they're prepared to disagree with each other, and often there's a bit of crack in book clubs. Sometimes there's a bit of wine flowing as well.
Always.
And one of the things I always regretted was, because I before the pandemic travelled so much, I could never be part of a regular book club. But during lockdown, I was asked to host a virtual book club for about 6 months. And I just loved it. I read books I would never have read as before, and I met people. There were people from all over Northern Ireland, and we had this Zoom virtual book club. And I must say, I really enjoyed being part of the book club for those 6 months. And actually, I think I think it was good for my mental health during lockdown. For someone who was so used to be travelling so much, to feel constrained in that way, to have those conversations about books.
Well, they're not intimidated by having an author in their midst. I would be thinking he's going to know way more about this than I do.
They didn't seem to be. I think maybe the first person said, "I'd never heard of you." Your books.
Oh, it's an Northern Ireland book club.
Yeah, so that keeps you grounded. What about you? What are your thoughts around just reading as something that's healthy, Lindsay?
I think it's absolutely brilliant. And for me, one of the things that went very quickly when I was unwell was the ability to read, and I found that really, really hard. The ability to sit down and to do anything, but certainly I always loved reading, and the ability to pick up and even just to follow the sentence or follow the theme of the story. And I I suppose then I stopped, and I've had to nearly get myself back in, get myself confidence to get back into to reading again. But for me, to be honest, I absolutely love reading some light-hearted stuff when I get the chance. I have a little boy, so I don't often get the chance to actually sit down and read. But I love an author called Sophie Kinsella, the Shopaholic series. And she kind of laugh out loud and funny. Yes, there's a heartfelt story that always works out okay in the end. You know, by the time you get to the end of it, the world is going to be right again. And over the summer, I picked up one of her books, and I actually took a picture and tweeted to say I was going to read it, and she came back to me and replied, so I was absolutely delighted. that was good for my mental health and well-being. But no, generally I think being able just to take some time out for yourself, particularly if you like reading, and to be able to do something that you enjoy, and sometimes even the silence and the comfort that comes with finding a seat to sit in, and if you like a blanket over you, or you like a hot drink in your hand, all of that comfort that comes with reading as well is part of the experience, I think.
Yes. And do you like the physical book, Lindsay? Yes.
Yeah,
that goes along with that kind of comfort thing, which is different from doing it on a Kindle, isn't it?
Oh, definitely, yeah. I don't think I've ever really bought a book on a Kindle. I don't know. On a Kindle, I think a couple of times somebody has handed me one to say, have a read of that, and it just doesn't. It doesn't for me seem the thing to do. I love having it, and I'm also somebody who likes to write and underline things in books, which I know annoys some people, but mine are always covered in stuff.
One of the first things I do when I get a book is I smell it. That's part of I love the smell of a new book as well. So, in your experience, in your work in mental health and addiction, what do you do you see the value of reading or perhaps writing? I mean, I know often people write.
We have both. I mean, obviously we have 65 different mental health services across the region, and very much writing and reading are a big part of therapy. I'm sure you would agree, Nicola. It is a very powerful tool in helping people understand, maybe communicate and write down their feelings, but also read and understand other people's thoughts and feelings around similar experiences. And I think that's a very powerful medium to use, so that there's no doubt, within Inspire we use that reading quite a lot in our services. But personally, I was a love-hate relationship with reading, and it goes back to being put in front of the girls' class in the girls' model school to read paragraphs out of books, and I was trembling in the boots, and I hated it, and I steered clear. And then when I was younger, the troubles and whatever else, there were a lot of things going on, and I became a carer for my father, so I didn't get a lot of time to invest in reading books. But recently I have, and again it's that finding a balance between reading reports and reading things with work that I'm not saying you hate, but it becomes monotonous, and finding the space and time to escape. And I love local readers. I love seeing that local connection, and I love backing local people. There's something special about the place that we live.
Great.
And I think the other thing, just in relation to books and children, no matter how much you're struggling, being able to read with your child or to your child, that kind of bonding that can happen in that, apart from what's good for the child, but that kind of relationship, I think the power of books with children. One of the things we did in the bereavement service every year, we read a story, because there were children in the audience, something like Badger's Parting Gifts or the Rabbitines, and they're so metaphorical, because it's usually about loss, but what you get, the gift that you get from the person, it's that continuing bond. So I just think, it's back to connections with books, connecting with the characters, connecting with each other in a book club, reading to people, and finding ways of making sense of things without actually having to say the hard words. It's really powerful.
And there is something about telling stories which is just so human. It's part of being a human being is that we tell stories, and that idea. We tell stories to children. We read bedtime stories to children. The tradition of fairy stories, and that's all over the world. That tradition of telling stories, and so there's something very powerful about storytelling that's inherently human, I think, for us as well. So just to finish today, it would be really great if you have any other recommendations, because in a normal book club at this stage we'd all have talked about the book that we read, and then we'd be trying to choose one for next time. So Any other suggestions of good books that you'd recommend to people?
Did I start off? Yeah,
Yes.
and then you because I'm not going to say a book. I'm going to stick with the Seamus Heaney thing.
Yes.
Whenever he came and read his poem, or recited his poem, he said, in the humble man he is, he said, my wife said to me, don't be going reading that out of gloomy poem and making people sad. Give them a bit of hope. And he read a poem called The Wishing Tree. So I would recommend people to read Seamus Heaney's The Wishing Tree, because it is a very fulfilling poem and one of hope, and I just think it touches a chord. So that's my recommendation.
Thanks, Nicola. And actually, if you've time, you could come here to the library in the Seamus Heaney Centre in Ballachy, because some of these wonderful poems are up on the wall, and there's the whole centre here where you could really dive into the poetry of Seamus Heaney as well. Thank you. Lindsay, any other books you would recommend?
Well, I'm going to recommend a book that I haven't actually read yet, simply because it's just been released and I'm waiting for it to arrive on my doorstep. And it's a book by a gentleman called Steve Austin, and it's called Hiding in the Pews. And it talks about the idea that many people within our churches and faith communities are struggling with mental ill health, and really challenging churches and faith communities about how to engage in that conversation well and engage in support well, and that's part of the work that I do as well. So I really can't wait to read both some personal reflections in it, but also some research that'll be there that'll be really helpful.
Great, thank you. And Alex?
Yeah, I think so. I would love to read your book, That Little House on the Peace Line, but I'll pick that up next, I think, and have a read of that. But other books I would recommend, there's a book called Man Down, and I have a particular interest in men's mental health, and you know how that needs to be supported in the work that we need to do. So I would recommend, you know, if there are men out there struggling, that it is a good book to try and understand some of the nuances and some of the difficulties that men experience, different than women, and how they can maybe look at that and address some of those issues.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Alex and Lindsay and Nicola, for joining us at this Inspire Mental Health and Wellbeing Book Club, and thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and wish you all the best and enjoy your reading.